Hey y'all, howdy. Welcome to One for the Books. I'm Sandra Broadwell, and today we're going to be talking about Don Quixote. This book is considered the first modern novel. It's over 400 years old at this point. It has been voted the greatest book of all time by the Nobel Institute, according to the little blurb on the back. Every major classic author has read Don Quixote. There's a quote on the back from Dostoevsky, which says, "Profound and powerful, the final and greatest utterance of the human mind." So, needless to say, this book has a load of hype. Is it worth the hype? I guess is what I'm trying to answer today. I really just want to chat about what worked and what didn't work for me, and just some questions that I have. Obviously, I'm not a scholar of history or classic literature, so I came away from this reading experience with a lot of questions and commentary, and just thought it'd be fun to chat about it with you all. Maybe some of you know a lot more about this than I do, and if so, please let me know down in the comments in response to some of the things that I'm going to say, or just some interesting factoids you'd like to share yourself. This is going to have spoilers in it, by the way. The book is over 400 years old, so I feel like it's on you at this point if you don't know anything about Don Quixote. You've been warned. So far, I have read book 1, which is the first 479 pages of this chunker of a book. It has that thin page, small font kind of vibe to it that makes it feel a little bit like a Bible. So the 479 pages were definitely a lot more text than I would consider a modern novel that only had 479 pages. Part 1 was originally published in 1605, and for the people of the day, that was its own novel. The second half, which is the sequel, was published 10 years later. And so if you were living back in the 1600s, these would have been two separate books. It's only in our modern world that we combine them and call them both Don Quixote. The total book itself is over 1,000 pages, including all of the notes at the back and things like that. So I've only read, again, part 1, the original novel, the first half. I have not read part 2 yet, but I feel like I have enough thoughts about this to have a whole video, so let's just dive in. So the author, Miguel de Cervantes, lived basically at the same time as William Shakespeare. He died in 1617, only 2 years after part 2 was published. Miguel de Cervantes had a really crazy sounding life to our modern ears. He fought in a war, and on his way home from the war, he was captured by pirates and sold into slavery. I believe he was a slave for over 5 years before his family finally ransomed him, and then became a famous author. It's just a really wild ride of a life. Definitely one that would make for an interesting autobiography, but he includes a lot of autobiographical details in this text itself. I'm not sure how wild of a life that was for people at the time, but it sounds pretty wild to me. So this is the Penguin Classics edition, as you can see. The basic premise of this book is that Don Quixote is a hidalgo, basically like a noble gentleman of the time, and he reads too many chivalrous romance novels, is kind of what they're called back in the day. They're basically stories about knights who go off gallivanting into the world, and they save princesses and they fight dragons and enchanters, and they have grand epic quests. Don Quixote basically reads too many of these books and goes mad and decides that he himself is a knight errant, and it is up to him to bring back chivalry to the world and go off gallivanting through the countryside of Spain and fight, all of the things. So this is where the famous tilting at windmills scene comes in that we all know, where Don Quixote has convinced himself that these windmills are giants and he needs to defeat them. This book started out honestly just really surprising to me because it was so funny. The first third of this book is very Three Stooges or It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia type humor, which I was having a really great time with. It's a lot of just slapstick comedy that obviously translates through the ages really, really well. When Don Quixote does go tilting at these windmills, he tries to like gallop up on his horse, who he's named Rocinante, and he calls it, you know, a noble steed. And in truth, Rocinante is like a pretty old and lazy old horse that like doesn't gallop. He like plods along. But he runs up to one of these windmills, and the arm of it comes by and like grabs his armor and like lifts him up into the air, and he gets defeated basically by it. He also picks up his sidekick Sancho Panza, which is his neighbor, who is not a nobleman. He is like a peasant or a farmer type of character. Sancho has not lost his marbles. He's considered not very intelligent, but he has some street smarts that Don Quixote does not have. But he gets wrapped up in Don Quixote's kind of view of the world and is convinced that if he is Don Quixote's squire, that Don Quixote will reward him by giving him like his own island or his own kingdom or something, because this is what Don Quixote keeps telling him that he's going to do. They get into a lot of silly hijinks. Sancho sometimes tries to talk Don Quixote out of these things and sometimes is along for the ride. One of the things sort of near the beginning of the book is that Don Quixote like rides up and comes across a young farmhand that is being beaten by the farmer for not doing his work adequately. The farm boy tells Don Quixote that that's not true and that he hasn't been paid by the farmer, and he just asked for his wages, and that's when the farmer started beating him. So Don Quixote takes up this young boy's cause and threatens to hurt the farmer if he doesn't let this boy go. And so the farmer's like, yeah, sure, I'll let him go. No worries, bro. And then as soon as Don Quixote rides away, the farmer just beats the boy like twice as hard as he did before. But Don Quixote is like congratulating himself on like doing an honorable deed. So there's just a lot of like silly humor in it like that often revolves around people getting the snot beat out of them. Sancho Panza definitely has a lot of really hilarious one-liners in here. There were several times that I did laugh out loud, and there's certainly a much higher percentage of poop jokes in here than I would have expected for a classic novel. In the meantime, Don Quixote has two friends back home, a priest and a barber, who are never named. They're just called the priest and the barber, who realize that Don Quixote has gone mad and wandered away from home. And they go to find out like what has happened to him, and they find his niece and his housekeeper at the house, and they're telling him that he read too many books, basically. And so the priest starts burning all of these chivalrous romantic books because he says they're just fluff and they have no value. But then he sees some that he's actually read and really enjoyed, and so he burns all of them except the ones that he actually approves of. So there is a lot of commentary in this book about the value of art and of novels and plays and things like that. And it's unclear sometimes if Miguel de Cervantes, the author, is actually speaking through his characters about how he dislikes all of the fluff and the art that doesn't have any moral code to it. It's just entertainment for the sake of entertainment and that sort of thing. Or if he's like being a cultural critic in the form of he knows that's what people will say about this novel and he's getting out ahead of it and like being a little tongue-in-cheek. It's really unclear to me what these themes are actually saying, if the author is speaking directly or if he is making fun of the characters who are saying these things. There's even a character towards the end of part one that argues for government censorship, about how if only the Crown could review all of these plays and novels and things that were being published at the time and only allow ones to be published that actually had some moral value and weren't just like empty fluff. Basically, most of what I've just said, all of the like hijinks that Don Quixote and Sancho get into, are pretty entertaining, and I definitely didn't get tired of it in the amount of time that it happened. But then after about the first 1/3, the second 2/3 of the book, I don't know if Miguel de Cervantes like ran out of steam for writing the story of Don Quixote, or if he had just like already written a bunch of unrelated short stories and wanted to include those, or if he just like felt the need to write a novel of a certain length but didn't have enough content to do so. But basically what happens after the first 1/3 is that suddenly you're reading a lot of short stories that have nothing to do with Don Quixote. And so like Don Quixote will like meet a shepherd, and the shepherd will tell him his life story. And that's the story that you read for the next like 2 chapters. And then Don Quixote will like meet an innkeeper, and the innkeeper will have like some interesting story about some person that they knew, and then you'll read that story for like 2 chapters. And then they'll be out on the road and they'll see a bunch of prisoners in a line, and you'll read the story of one of the prisoners. And then at one point he meets back up with the priest and the barber, and the priest just like picks up a book and starts reading it out loud. And then you're like reading the book through Don Quixote, listening to the priest read the book for several chapters. So basically my interest severely waned in the last 2/3 of the book. And the fact that all of the cultural references that I know about Don Quixote, the fact that those happened in the first 1/3 of the book that I already talked about, makes me wonder if a lot of people like don't get past that part, because that's where it stops being funny, and the value of reading it at that point depends on your interest level for the individual characters and their stories, most of which I found to be incredibly boring and nonsensical, which is a shame. I really was having a good time when we were focusing on Don Quixote and Sancho Panza's silly adventures, and then when we got into silly adventures of other people, they just got really, really repetitive. So Don Quixote becomes a framing story for a series of vignettes. Most of the vignettes are about a incredibly beautiful, incredibly virtuous woman. Every woman in Don Quixote is incredibly beautiful and incredibly virtuous if she has a significant role in the story. Basically, if she's a named character. Other characters who are women who don't have a significant role in the story are not beautiful and virtuous, basically, and are not given names. So things like the niece, the housekeeper, the innkeeper's wife, the innkeeper's daughter is how they are referenced if they are not very beautiful and virtuous. And so the case with most of these stories is it's told from the perspective of a man, whether he be a goat herd or a nobleman or literally anyone. He sees this woman, whether from a distance or he knows her personally from growing up with her or has never even spoken to her before. He's just seen her through a window. He pines and lusts after this woman, and generally his pining and lusting is unrequited, either because the woman doesn't know he exists or the woman isn't allowed to marry him for X, Y, and Z reasons. And this generally results in the men who are telling these stories to either go mad or cast off their normal life and go cry about it in the wilderness, or sometimes go on pretty murderous rampages, is kind of the way these stories generally play out. Those fits of madness or violence usually come to an end when the woman agrees to marry the man, and then he becomes sane and virtuous again, and that's kind of how most of these stories wrap up. There was one story that I really liked about a woman who was, I believe, a shepherdess, and there were quite a few men that were pining after her because she was, of course, the most beautiful, most virtuous maiden in the land. And she basically like came down from the hills and told all of the men who were gathered, like, please just leave me alone. I just enjoy being a lonely shepherdess and like doing my own thing with my sheep. And like, slay queen. That's pretty amazing. And in that case, the man who was pining after her ended up killing himself because she didn't want him. And then all of the other men who had been pining after her basically called her an evil whore. So you can see how women are treated in Don Quixote. It's not great. There's one short story about a man who is happily married to a woman, but he's convinced that things are too good in his marriage and she must be like secretly cheating on him or something. And so he tries to convince his best friend to seduce her in order to prove that she is not virtuous as she seems. There's a really self-referential tale about a man who is a captive overseas, like Cervantes was himself, and he is rescued by a beautiful, virtuous woman, and they escape back to Spain together. Basically, these stories, like I said, they all kind of follow these sorts of themes and ideas, and they get really, really repetitive. In fact, right at the end of part 1, there was like another story about a goat herd who was like pining after this woman, and he couldn't have her, so like him and his other buddy who were pining after her like went out into the fields to like be goat herds in isolation because they couldn't have her, and they were telling their story to Don Quixote. And I was like, this sounds exactly like one of the tales that we heard earlier. I was like, is this the same story just from a different point of view? And I actually went back and looked to see if the names were the same, but no, the names were all different. So it was a new story, but it was just like recycled material, which just makes me wonder, like, did the author, like, did he just run out of ideas? What is happening? Why are we hearing the same tale over and over again? I don't understand if it's trying to be funny or I don't know. It was just really odd. In the end, the priest and the barber, who are friends of Don Quixote, trick him into going back to his house because he's been out gallivanting on adventures for months by convincing a beautiful woman to pretend to be the queen of a made-up country and to tell him that she needs help, like slaying a giant or something. And so he agrees to help her, and she helps lead him back to his house. Don Quixote learns no lessons. There's no character arc whatsoever. And a lot of times other characters, even though Don Quixote does like kill people and beat people up, and he thinks of himself obviously as being really good and virtuous, but he does a lot of bad things. But he is like clearly suffering a psychotic episode throughout the entire book where he thinks he is this like royally appointed knight. And there are characters who realize this is happening to him and try to go along with it for the sake of helping him. And then there are other characters who go along with it for the sake of making fun of him. And a lot of times they play some pretty vicious pranks on Don Quixote, which is really sad. Honestly, I know like the author tries to use it for comedic effect, but with our modern sensibilities, like playing pranks on a madman because he is having a psychotic episode is not cool. It's really sad. There's also a lot of pranks at the expense of Sancho Panza because he is stupid or because he is poor. There's a lot of really negative things that I think were common of the day. Negative things about Moors and slaves and Africans. So obviously, like, the book is not politically correct in any sense of the word. But I think it was probably really groundbreaking at the time. And this book references a ton of mythology and a ton of history, which wasn't necessarily history at the time. It was like modern things that were happening. And I think if I had a much better understanding of literature at this time, as well as history, that I would have found this to be a lot more insightful. And I definitely think that if I was living in this day and age, that this would have been like the most witty and the most stunning book that I had ever read, in my life, which I think is why it is still such the classic that it is today, because the humor, again, slapstick humor just doesn't get old. Like it's something that translates to our modern day really, really well. It's just all the like other randomness in the book that doesn't. And I didn't think that that was going to be the case when I had read the first third of it. I was like, this is so like funny and cool and like so accessible, like way more so than I thought a classic would be. And then it really, for me at least, went off the rails with all of the short stories and the treatment of women in general throughout. So that's pretty much all I have to say, I guess, about Don Quixote Part 1. Should you read this book? I mean, I don't see why not. I think if you are someone who really likes history and think that this sounds amusing, because it definitely is, that you will enjoy it. Is it deserving of all of the hype that it has in our modern day? I mean, that's not for me to say. I'm not a scholar about these things. I think that if the book was just the first 1/3 of the book, it would be so iconic. And I think, you know, those parts of the story, the Don Quixote tilting at windmills and, you know, believing that he's like slaying giants and rescuing maidens and things when he's actually just like wreaking havoc on the local towns. It's classic. All of the other stories, not so much. When Don Quixote was first published, it was basically like an instant hit, a bestseller. People loved it. And it was so popular that in the 10 years between part 1 and part 2 being published, some other person, somewhat anonymously, published a sequel to Don Quixote as if they were the original author. This really pissed off Cervantes, from what I understand. And so there are apparently in part 2 references to either the author or the sequel, because the sequel was really popular as well, the unsanctioned sequel. But at the time, like, sequels weren't even really a thing, and there weren't any rules about copyright and like who has the right to tell another part of a story. It's basically like fan fiction that became really popular. So apparently part 2 is at least partially in response to the false sequel that was published much later on. So I am interested to see how that's going to play out, but also I am just interested in part 2 to know, like, what more does Cervantes have to say about these characters? And is it going to be more like silly, fun adventures of Don Quixote himself and Sancho Panza, or is it just going to be like another framing device for more completely unrelated short stories that get really repetitive? I don't know. It's probably going to take me a long time to finish this book. I don't know if I'll do a second video with my thoughts on part 2, but if I do, I will be sure to link it down below after I have final thoughts on it. And if not, then I will just link the wrap up where I talk about finishing this book. Thank you all so much for tuning in and listening to me ramble about this classic novel. If you've read it, please let me know down in the comments below what your thoughts of it, if they align with mine, if you completely disagree with my assessment of the story, or if you have any insights into anything that I said. I'd love to hear about it. As always, please be kind, read books, and hit the subscribe button below for more bookish content to come. I'll see you soon.